Today's date is May 2nd, 2006. Shortly after midnight tonight, an Airbus A320, registration EK 32009, operated by the Armenian national carrier Armavia, will undertake Flight 967, a scheduled international service between the Armenian capital Yerevan and the Russian city of Sochi, approximately 840 kilometers away to the northwest. A relatively short hop, the expected flight time will be no more than 1 hour and 15 minutes. As Flight 967 commences pushback and engine start, its weight will be just under 63,000 kilos, 10,000 of which will be fuel, more than sufficient to satisfy the legal requirements for a flight of this duration. On board will be 113 people of 4 different nationalities, 105 passengers including 5 children and 1 baby, and an all-Armenian crew of 2 pilots, 5 flight attendants and 1 company engineer. The aircraft will be serviceable prior to departure, with the company engineer being carried merely to oversee routine servicing tasks during the turnaround in Sochi. The 1900 Zulu actual weather report for Sochi, issued about 1 hour and 45 minutes before departure, will read as wind calm, visibility 2,700 metres in light rain showers, mist broken at 1,200 metres, the equivalent of 3,900 feet, temperature +11, dew point +11, sea level pressure 1018 hectopascals, with a short forecast for the following 2 hours indicating no major changes to be expected. In summary, the presence of reported mist and with no spread between the temperature and dew point, the crew may well decide to keep a close eye on things as the morning progresses and plan accordingly, but in reality, nothing in this report would give any great cause for concern. In addition to this actual weather report called a METAR, the crew will be made aware of a longer forecast for Sochi, covering the time window from 1800 Zulu on the evening of the 2nd of May until 0300 Zulu on the morning of the 3rd, a forecast which will encompass the entirety of the proposed flight. It will read wind 060 at 6 meters per second or 12 knots, visibility more than 10 kilometers, in light rain showers, mist scattered at 210 meters, the equivalent of 700 feet, broken cumulonimbus clouds at 450 meters, the equivalent of 1,500 feet, broken at 3,000 meters, the equivalent of 10,000 feet, with temporarily within that time window the wind being variable at 2 meters per second or 4 knots, visibility 800 meters and fog with a vertical visibility of 600 meters. Subsequently, the accident investigation will establish this to be a typo error, where the insertion of an additional single digit promulgated a report indicating 600 meters which should have actually read 60 meters. Although this in itself will have no direct impact on the events which follow, conceivably it may have contributed to a false mental model on the crew's part as to what to expect, and may have conditioned them to be less expectant of sudden and dramatic changes in the weather at their destination. With this forecasted wind favouring a landing on runway 06 at Sochi, the possibility of meteorological visibility dropping occasionally to values of as low as 800 metres will have the potential to cause some operational disruption, as the minimum visibility required to shoot an approach onto this particular runway is 2,300 metres. Additionally, whereas a vertical visibility of 600 metres, the equivalent of 1,800 feet, would pose no specific challenge to the crew, one of 60 metres, or 180 feet equivalent, on the other hand, would be considerably less than the published minima for the ILS approach onto runway 06, where the decision altitude, or DA, the final point on the approach at which the crew must visually acquire the landing runway, is set at 170 metres or 560 feet equivalent. This in itself, from an operational context, is nothing unusual. In such circumstances, commanders will routinely upload additional fuel before departure in order to facilitate airborne holding if necessary, while awaiting an improvement in poor weather conditions. Should the weather ultimately not facilitate an approach, then fuel reserves, by law, must be sufficient to allow the aircraft to divert to an alternative airfield. Indeed, the commander of Flight 967 will ultimately decide on a fuel figure which will facilitate a return to Yerevan if that becomes necessary. However, Such a diversion back to Yerevan, or any other alternate field, will never happen. In just over an hour's time, Flight 967 will make a failed attempt to land at Sochi, where the crew will subsequently lose control of their aircraft and impact the dark waters of the Black Sea below, killing all of those on board. As with many aviation accidents, an explanation of what happened is often more readily arrived at than one of why. This is an effort to do just that, and highlight how a combination of emotional stress, surprise and spatial disorientation will ultimately claim a perfectly serviceable aircraft and all those on board. This is the complete story of Armavia 967.
Knots. V1.
As 967 climbs into the darkness, leaving the city lights of Yerevan behind, in command will be Captain Grigor Grigorian, age 40. His experience will total 5,500 hours, of which 1,500 will be on the A320 type, with approximately one-third of that in command. His colleague in the right-hand seat will be First Officer Arman Douatian, age 29. His experience will extend to just over 2,000 hours, approximately half of which will have been obtained on the 320. During the early part of its climb, 967 will turn to the northwest, and at 2051 Zulu will be instructed by local ATC to proceed to the en route fix of Tiblo. Acknowledging the clearance, the crew will subsequently ask for a more direct en route track to waypoint Tunis, which will be approved. The approach controller will subsequently instruct 967 to climb to flight level 6,000 metres, the equivalent of flight level 200 or 20,000 feet, and relinquish his control of the flight by handing them off to the regional ATC centre, Yerevan Control. Upon first contact with Yerevan, the crew will be instructed to climb to flight level 9,200 metres, the equivalent of flight level 300 or 30,000 feet. 20:59 Zulu, 13 minutes after departure, 967 will report, Control, Armavia 967 approaching a beam Tunis, flight level 9,200 metres. Yerevan Air Traffic Control will subsequently acknowledge the call and instruct the crew to contact Tbilisi Control as the aircraft approaches the international frontier with Georgia. Seconds later, the voices of ATC in Tbilisi's northern sector will be heard on the radio. Armavia 967, good night. Monitoring you on radar. Climb flight level 10,400 metres, direct to Banat. With little traffic in the skies, this clearance will allow 967 to transit Georgian airspace and route direct to the initial point on the instrument arrival for runway 06 in Sochi. From Banat, the routing will continue via waypoints Taban and Gukin to establish on the extended centerline for runway 06. Although altimetry will play no direct part in this evening's events, the following will provide some background information and explanation of the clearances being issued. Although Russian procedures have fundamentally changed over the recent past in order to ensure consistency with the recognised industry norms, in many regards significant differences still exist. As is current practice, once the aircraft climbs through the transition altitude, the subscale of the aircraft's altimeter is reset so that the instrument reads altitude above the 1013 millibar standard pressure datum. The altimeter on most aircraft throughout the world thus depicts the altitude in feet above this datum, known as the flight level. For example, the PFD shown here indicates that the aircraft is maintaining flight level 390, or approximately 39,000 feet above the 1013 pressure datum. This procedure is known as flying reference to Q&E. Airbus aircraft are fitted with a facility whereby, at the pilot's discretion, the equivalent metric conversion target and current metric conversion of the imperial altitude display can be simultaneously shown on the PFD. However, the case in 2006 was somewhat different and reflected a metric system still employed today in some states such as China and Mongolia. At the time, flight levels above the transition altitude were allocated on the base of meters above the 1013 millibar datum and not feet. Therefore, in order to fly 39,000 feet above the datum, as in the example shown, back in 2006 the aircraft would have been cleared to maintain flight level 11,900 meters. It's only one small problem. 11,900 meters doesn't exactly translate into 39,000 feet. From the conversion chart, it can be seen that 11,900 meters equates to 39,100 feet. Thus, as the altimeter only displays imperial feet, in order to comply with the clearance and fly a flight level of 11,900 meters, the crew will actually have to select 39,100 as the target altitude to be acquired and accept that this will allow for compliance with ATC instruction. The situation becomes even more complicated at low level and reflects the current state of play even now in 2021. As the aircraft descends below the transition level, the altimeter subscale is reset to reflect the local QNH. With the altimeter set to the local QNH setting, it will read the actual altitude above sea level for that particular local region. As all mapped terrain in the area is measured in feet above sea level, setting the altimeter to QNH will facilitate a direct comparison between the aircraft's altitude and the surrounding terrain. However, in Russia, as Western altimeters will only read in feet and the ATC cleared altitude will be issued in meters, again the crew will have to make reference to the conversion table seen earlier, find the equivalent imperial conversion of the clearance, and ultimately set it as the target altitude to acquire. With no further resetting of the altimeter subscale, landing with QNH set means that the altimeter on touchdown will indicate the runway's elevation above sea level. Indeed, most airlines across the globe operate in such a manner, but the situation in Russia is very different. Within 50 kilometres or 27 nautical miles of the airport, ATC will issue metric altitude clearance reference to QFE. This requires a further altimeter subscale change and resets the datum. Now, instead of reading altitude above sea level, the altimeter will display height above the runway, so that upon touchdown the altimeter, instead of indicating the runway's elevation, will instead read 0. Some argue that the logic of touchdown equaling 0 is perfectly reasonable and sound. However, mapped terrain is not depicted with reference to QFE, and so the pilot's situational awareness of the environment around his aircraft stands to be compromised. It is primarily for this reason that the practice was abandoned many years ago in pretty much every other region of the globe. Examining the expected track of the previous direct clearance to Banat, Tbilisi will realise that the flight will pass very close to the frontier with Turkey. Inadvertent crossing into Turkish airspace will be unacceptable, so a revised clearance will be issued to waypoint Barus in order to safeguard separation. 967, proceed to Barras at present. You are going to cross the frontier. The frontier is very close, heading to Barras at present. 21 minutes after departure from Yerevan, the Tbilisi controller will issue an updated weather observation for Sochi. 967, Sochi weather is reported as 2,000 metres by 170 metres, runway 06 and 02. Although the reported cloud base is just about at the minimum acceptable for runway 06, the visibility is less than required minimum of 2,300 metres, the published minimum requirements for runway 02 being even higher. On the strength of this report, it will not be possible to make an approach onto either runway. The crew of 967 will acknowledge the report and continue, at least for now. At 21:05 and 49 seconds, satisfied with the aircraft's avoidance of the Turkish border, 967 will be re-cleared again direct to Banat. The clearance will also come with a handoff to the next Tbilisi controlling sector and the new controlling frequency of 113.4. Shortly after, the aircraft will level at its cruise flight level of 10,400 metres, or roughly 34,000 feet. At 21:08 and 35 seconds, the flight data recorder will record the transfer of control responsibilities from Autopilot 1 to Autopilot 2. One can only assume that the captain will do this in order to delegate handling duties temporarily to his first officer, while he attempts to formulate a plan in light of the most recent weather report for the destination. The A320 is fitted with 2 identical VHF radios. Normal practice would be to have number 1 tuned to the controlling ATC frequency in use, while number 2 is used infrequently for such tasks as listening to weather broadcasts or engaging in other non-ATC related conversations. While still under the control of Tbilisi ATC and continuing to monitor their frequency on the number 1 radio, the commander will make use of the second set and initiate a call ahead to the approach controller in Sochi. He will confirm with them the content of the report he has just received and seek clarification as to whether or not the conditions are expected to improve. At 21:10 and 46, he will respond, Armavia 967, well, now the weather is below minima here. That is, on runway 06, a ceiling of 170 metres and visibility 2,000 metres. 02, ceiling of 170 metres and visibility 2,000 metres. 220 is required here. Hearing these comments, the captain will state, well, I've got the fuel, yes, for an hour of flight. Is 2,500 expected within the hour? Referring to the possibility of an improvement in the visibility. Some 5 minutes later, at 21:16:07, having consulted with a forecaster, the approach controller will advise, Armavia 967, so the forecast for the next 2 hours, 150 metres by 1,500 metres. Rather than suggesting any improvement, this forecast will state that for at least the next 2 hours, weather at the field will be below published minima for either runway, effectively meaning that the airport will be closed to all inbound traffic. The forecast, however, will not be entirely accurate. In his effort to get this information to the crew, the approach controller will neglect to highlight the fact that the values quoted were to be expected only temporarily over the 2-hour time window. Without being made aware of this subtle differentiation, Captain Gregorian will inform Sochi that the best possible option for him is to return to Yerevan. At 21:16 and 14 seconds, 29 minutes after departure, the captain will inform Tbilisi Control that in light of the conversation he has just had with Sochi ATC, he has made the decision to return to Yerevan. At 21:16 and 34 seconds, Tbilisi Control will approve the captain's request to divert. With the diversion underway and leaving Sochi behind him, at 21:26 and 31 seconds, the captain will call Sochi one last time. This time he will ask for a specific weather observation to be made. While waiting for the results, he will inform the controller that they have deputies on board. This is not the case, but his intention, or hope, is that such a declaration may apply some pressure and result in a more favourable weather report when it subsequently arrives. Sure enough, at 21:30 and 49 seconds, the Sochi approach controller will inform the crew that the reported weather has indeed shown a slight improvement. Armavia 967, visibility now 3,600 metres, ceiling 170 metres for the last 30 minutes. The weather is around the limit, but okay so far. Be this accurate or otherwise, this will be the break that Captain Gregorian has been hoping for. At 21, 31 and 04 seconds, he will report to Tbilisi Control his intentions to reverse his previous decision and once again set course for Sochi. Tbilisi 967, we are requesting heading to Banat. Sochi is open again now. Tbilisi will accommodate his request without delay and issue the necessary revised clearance. A final call ahead to Sochi approach confirms his actions. Sochi 967, we are coming back. That means flying to Sochi. At 21, 40 and 44 seconds, this weather report will be confirmed by Tbilisi Control. At 967, visibility in Sochi 3,600 metres with cloud ceiling of 170 metres. Advise once again endurance and alternate. To which Captain Gregorian will reply, endurance 2.5 hours, alternates Rostov and Yerevan. From 2141 Zulu, the cockpit voice recorder will record the crew as they review the relevant approach plates and prepare for their arrival into Sochi. The airport of Sochi itself is located in the district of Aldar, along the coast some 20 kilometres southeast of the city. With an elevation of 89 feet above sea level, the local terrain rises rapidly as one moves inland, as can be seen here with the depiction of the aircraft on finals to runway 06. Runway 0624 is one of two runways which make up the airport infrastructure. At 3,000 metres, or just under 9,500 feet, it is the longer of the two. The second runway 0220 extends to 2,200 metres long, or just over 7,200 feet. As a result of the topographical issues, the designated landing runways are runways 02 and 06. Approaches for both are over the sea, with missed approaches requiring a rapid right-hand turn in the reciprocal direction in order to avoid the rising terrain ahead. For the same reason, designated runways for departure are runways 20 and 24, with departures flown away from the high terrain, out over the Black Sea. Both landing runways are serviced with ILS instrument approaches, certified for Category 1 operations only. Typically, this class of an approach would have a DA or decision altitude of 200 feet above the ground. In the case of Sochi, however, because of the local topography, these minima are significantly higher, ensuring that visual acquisition of the runway is necessary much earlier than would normally be the case. During this review of the expected approach procedures, we will start to get an insight into the cognitive state of the captain in particular. Cockpit voice recordings will suggest that he has become quite fixated on landing in Sochi and nowhere else. In effect, he has begun to develop tunnel vision, with one and only one goal in mind. At 21:52 and 32 seconds, having already received descent clearance from Tbilisi Control, a target flight level of 6,600 metres, the equivalent of 22,000 feet, will be set and descent commenced. With the automation engaged, there are three possible methods to choose from in order to physically descend the A320, and in reality, depending on the circumstances, the crew will use a combination of all three on any given flight. One method, and the most commonly used descent from high altitude, is the managed descent. Here the pilot pre-programs the flight management and guidance computer, or the FMGEC, with data relating to the desired descent speed, course of navigation, and expected altitude constraints along the way. Armed with this information, the FMGEC will instruct the autopilot to manage the descent in accordance with the pilot's wishes. The second method demonstrates a little less finesse. In an open descent, the pilot will make a conscious decision to ignore the computed descent profile, forcing the elevators to control the desired descent speed with pitch changes as the engine thrust is commanded to idle. In the third, the pilot may choose to select a specific descent rate. This will therefore become the priority, again ignoring any of the previous data entered into the FMGEC. In maintaining this rate of descent, the desired speed will be controlled using engine power rather than through the pitch inputs of the elevator. In the case of 967, the descent from altitude will be commenced in managed mode, with the calculated descent rate of 1,000 feet per minute. Unhappy with the automation's performance, Captain Gregorian, expressing considerable frustration, will revert to open descent. The fault, however, actually rests with the captain himself. While pre-programming the arrival into the FMGEC, he will inadvertently add additional mileage to the expected track distance to touchdown. As a result, the aircraft will believe that there is much further to run to the landing runway than will actually be the case. Once it transpires that this additional mileage will not be flown, the actual remaining distance will mean that the aircraft will be high on the descent profile. The transition from managed to selected open descent will double the rate of descent, but nonetheless pose a challenge to the crew. Although this series of events will not be a contributing factor in the loss of Armavia 967, the subsequent report does make reference to it and highlights one of two possibilities. Either the captain does not fully understand the workings of the autopilot algorithm, or alternatively, in light of the growing evidence of tunnel vision, the imperative to land at Sochi as soon as possible is giving rise to observable anxiety and psycho-emotional strain. In a similar context, the subsequent report will also highlight that communication between the two crew members will reveal their reluctance to elicit any further weather reports from the controllers in Sochi, for fear of what might be relayed. At 21:58 and 40 seconds, Tbilisi will hand the aircraft off to Rostov control as 967 approaches Russian airspace. Rostov control, Armavia 967, good night, Banut, flight level 6,600 meters. In reply, Rostov will acknowledge radar contact and issue further descent clearance to 4,800 meters, the equivalent to 16,000 feet, and later to 3,600 meters, the equivalent of 12,000 feet, with further instructions to contact Sochi approach. Sochi approach, Armavia 967, good evening once again, descending to 3,600 meters to Guken. Having acknowledged their log-on at 22:01 and 25 seconds while descending towards Sochi, the approach controller will indicate to the crew is concerned that they are excessively high on the descent profile. Armavia 967, you're still flying too high. Continue descent 1,800 meters to Guken and copy Sochi weather on the hour. This 2200 weather will read as visibility 4,000 meters, wind 100 degrees at 1 meter per second in light rain showers and mist, broken cloud cover at 180 meters, overcast cumulonimbus cloud cover at 820 meters, temperature 11, dew point 11, QFE for Sochi Airport 1016 hectopascals, with temporarily the visibility dropping to 1500 meters in mist, with a vertical visibility of 150 meters. Although marginal, this report will be above what is legally required to commence an approach. At 22:02 and 19 seconds, the controller again pointed out the fact that the aircraft's altitude was excessive to enter the terminal control area. Armavia 967, you're passing Taban. If able, expedite descent or you'll overshoot the final turn. At 22:03 and 13 seconds, Sochi approach will hand the aircraft off to the final approach controller. It is he who will provide radar coverage for the crew as they position themselves onto the instrument approach to runway 06. Armavia 967, your position 220 degrees magnetic, distance 43. Contact radar 119.7. At this stage, the aircraft will have just passed the Taban waypoint at 3,900 meters, or the equivalent of 12,700 feet, and will be descending at high speed in an effort to lose the excessive height. They will reset the altimeter subscale to the airfield QFE and call the director. Sochi radar, Armavia 967, good evening. Descending 1,800 meters to Guken. We have the weather information for landing QFE 1016. Radar will acknowledge their log-on and further clear them to make the right-hand turn onto final on reaching Guken, and to continue the descent to 600 meters QFE, the equivalent of 2,000 feet. This is the lowest height that radar can clear the flight to. Descent below this height will only occur with the aircraft's interception of the ILS glide slope. Entering the turn onto finals at 22:03 and 56 seconds, the aircraft will be at an altitude of 3,120 metres, or about 10,250 feet, with an indicated airspeed of 280 knots, that's 520 kilometres per hour, and descending at a rate of just over 2,500 feet per minute. As expected, their excessive speed, symptomatic of their efforts to lose altitude as quickly as possible, will cause them to overshoot the runway centreline. Maintaining a 25-degree bank turn, the autopilot will be disengaged for a short period of 14 seconds. One can only assume in an effort to tighten up the turn, as Captain Gregorian will target a heading of 090 due east in an effort to re-establish. At 22:05 and 50 seconds, radar will inform the crew, Armavia 967, you appear to be left of the landing course. You can turn onto a heading of 090 to intercept. The crew will respond, Armavia 967, we have turned already, heading 090, thanks. At 22:07 and 02 seconds, established on an intercept heading of 090, the crew will arm the approach mode. This ensures that as the aircraft approaches the ILS localizer, the automated systems will capture its signal and turn the aircraft in order to maintain and track inbound the extended runway centreline. The glide slope capture mode will also be simultaneously armed. As the aircraft, currently level at 600 metres, approaches the ILS glide slope, it will likewise be acquired, and the automated systems will follow its 3-degree descent profile from the current altitude all the way down to touchdown. At approximately 40 kilometres from touchdown, 967 will establish on finals to runway 06. From here, only a short 6 minutes remain before the aircraft and all those on board are lost. The pace of events, particularly in the latter part of this 6-minute time frame, would be frantic and retrospectively can be broken down into 3 distinct segments. The first, from interception of the extended runway centreline until discontinuation of the approach. The second, from this discontinuation until autopilot disengagement. And finally the third, relating to those events following autopilot disengagement until impact with the sea. At 22:07 and 35 seconds, still on a heading of 090 to intercept the final approach course, the approach controller informed 967 of the current weather. Armavia 967, we've been given cloud base 160 metres, visibility 4,000 metres. Proceed at 600 metres without descent. The crew confirmed, without descent, 600 metres, Armavia 967. The implications of this weather report are significant. In Western operations, the visibility alone is controlling, and the minimum value published for the approach, 2,300 metres, in the case of the ILS approach here for 06, must only be achieved as the aircraft descends through 1,000 feet above the airdrome level. If at this point the criteria cannot be met, further descent is prohibited and the approach must be terminated. However, should this criteria be satisfied, but subsequently on the latter part of the approach the visibility drops below the minimum value, then the captain is authorised to continue descent to the DA, or decision altitude, and make an assessment as to whether or not enough visual reference exists to allow for descent below DA to a landing. In Russia, however, as with many other things, differences and local rules pertain. As the minimum published cloud base for this approach is 170 metres, the report which the controller has just passed indicates that the current weather at 160 metres is less than this minimum value, and as such, he has the authority to prohibit Captain Gregorian from descending below his current altitude of 600 metres. Hence the instruction, proceed at 600 metres without descent. To clarify, the flight has now been approved to continue inbound along the extended centreline of the runway, maintaining the localizer, but unless subsequently cleared, must not capture and descend along the ILS glide slope. Looking outside, the landing lights begin to catch the reflection of raindrops as they rapidly pass the aircraft. 12 seconds later, the aircraft begins to acquire the ILS localizer, with the left-hand bank of 22 degrees to establish. At 22:08 and 14 seconds, this acquisition is complete, and 967 successfully begins to track inbound to the airport along the extended centreline of runway 06. At a distance of just over 40 kilometers, the aircraft's speed is now 205 knots. At 22:08 and 31 seconds, despite no clearance for the approach being forthcoming, Captain Gregorian nevertheless decides to start configuring the aircraft for landing. 19 seconds later, the initial selection of flap 1 was made. On the A320, selection of flap 1 will extend the leading edge slats only to a position of 18 degrees. This is the effect of increasing the margin to aerodynamic stall and facilitates higher angles of attack being flown as the aircraft ultimately slows to its final approach speed. 30 seconds later, flap 2 was selected. This further extends the leading edge to 22 degrees, while also extending the trailing edge by 15 degrees. The effect here is to increase the total surface area of the wing in order to provide lift augmentation as the aircraft continues to slow towards its final approach speed. At 22:09 and 33 seconds, the approach controller advised Armavia 967 contact tower 4,000 metres by 190 metres, 1 to 1.1, and cleared them for descent with the procedure as the cloud ceiling was now above the 170 metres they required. At 22:09 and 46 seconds, the crew extended the landing gear and 8 seconds later engaged the second autopilot, Autopilot 2, as a redundancy measure in order to provide uninterrupted autopilot operation should the first autopilot fail for whatever reason on the approach.
Gear down.
At 22:09 and 59 seconds, 967 contacted the tower. Sochi Tower, Armavia 967, good evening, on finals for runway 06, to which the tower replied, good evening Armavia 967, Sochi Tower, distance 14 on track, now 13 kilometers approaching the glide path. With capture of the ILS glide path, it would provide vertical guidance to allow accurate descent from 600 meters to the runway ahead. Indicated airspeed was now 143 knots, 6 knots above what would be the flight's final approach speed. At 22:10 and 27 seconds, 967 captured the ILS glide path for runway 06 and commenced its descent following its 3-degree inclination to the runway. 19 seconds later, the crew reported that they were established on the glide slope with landing gear extended, ready for landing. In response, the tower confirmed their distance as being 10 kilometers and reported visibility as 4,000 meters with a measured cloud base of 190 meters, then informed them that they were clear to land. At 22:11 and 08 seconds, at an altitude of 510 meters, or just over 1,600 feet, flaps were extended to position 3. This provides no further extension of the leading edge beyond the previous 22 degrees, but does extend the trailing edge a further 5 degrees to a maximum of 20. At 22:11 and 21 seconds, at an altitude of 465 meters, or just over 1,500 feet, and an indicated airspeed of 143 knots, flap extension to full position was initiated. This further extends the leading edge to the final position of 27 degrees, and likewise positions the trailing edge to its final position of 35 degrees. 4 seconds later, the crew addresses the items on the landing checklist. 19 seconds later, at 22:11 and 40 seconds, the tower controller instructed the crew. Armavia 967, stop descent. Cloud base 100 meters. Turn right, climb 600 meters. To which the crew confirmed, turn right, climb 600, Armavia 967. At that moment, the aircraft was 7 kilometers from touchdown at an altitude of 390 meters, or just under 1,300 feet, and an indicated airspeed of 139 knots. This specific intervention by the Sochi Tower controller will have a direct impact on the fate of Armavia 967 and brings to the fore yet another significant difference between local Russian procedures and those of their counterparts in the West. In the West, once the approach has been commenced, in the context of changeable weather, ATC has no authority to intervene and order a termination of the approach. Such a decision rests with the captain and the captain alone. However, local Russian procedures do allow ATC to intervene in such a manner, but only for domestic carriers. Armavia, by definition, was an international carrier conducting an international flight between the independent Armenian Republic and the Russian Federation. Admittedly, Armenia had, prior to 1991, been part of the Soviet Union, but this was most definitely not the case in May 2006. Thus, the controller's intervention should not have happened. Furthermore, his instructions, which were obviously intended as an order to terminate the approach, never specifically included the phrase "go around," which is accepted as the correct international phraseology to be used in such circumstances. Thus, it is very conceivable that Captain Gregorian perceived this as a direction to manoeuvre the aircraft in a specific manner, rather than an instruction to terminate the approach and go around. What supports this theory is what the captain does next. From the moment 967 levels off to impact with the sea is a very confusing and complex 74 seconds. In order to better understand why this accident happened, it's important to have a fundamental understanding of what actually happened. To achieve this, what Captain Gregorian saw on his PFD, or his primary flight display, will be reproduced here in a diagrammatic form. The PFDs are located one in front of each pilot. They display the same information but importantly rely on different generation sources in order that one single point of failure does not impact all cockpit instrumentation. The instrument itself incorporates what most would refer to as the traditional artificial horizon, the blue half of the display indicating the direction of the sky and conversely the brown depicting the direction of the ground. To the left is displayed the aircraft's speed. The current presentation indicates an airspeed being flown of 140 knots, with a target speed produced from the FMGEC of 133. To the right is firstly displayed the altimeter. As indicated, the aircraft is currently at 1,520 feet above sea level, with the regional QNH setting of 1018 hectopascals having been set on the altimeter subscale. With metric equivalents being selected, this 1,500 feet equates to an altitude of 460 metres. The target altitude of 2,000 feet, or the equivalent of 600 metres, indicated in blue, represents the crew-selected altitude that the aircraft will acquire in the event of a go-around or missed approach. On the extreme right is located the vertical speed indicator. It indicates here that the aircraft is descending at 700 feet per minute. The ILS glide slope and localizer scales indicate the aircraft's position in relation to the ideal 3-degree descent profile to the runway, and its lateral positioning in relation to the extended runway centerline. Center scale for both indicates that 967 is on the correct descent profile and tracking inwards on the centerline. Across the bottom of the instrument is displayed a compass, while across the top is displayed the FMA, or the Flight Mode Annunciator. The Flight Mode Annunciator provides vital information to the pilot on what autothrust, autopilot and flight director modes are actually engaged. From left to right here, the presentation indicates that the autothrust is managing the speed of the aircraft. The autopilot, flight director, pitch mode and guidance are locked into the ILS glide slope. Likewise, the autopilot, flight director, roll modes and guidance are locked into the ILS localizer signal. The landing capability of the aircraft in this configuration and utilising this level of automation is Cat 3 Joule, essentially indicating the aircraft's ability to land blind. And finally, the extreme right-hand column displays the current automation status. Here, both autopilots 1 and 2 are engaged, as are flight directors 1 and 2, as depicted by the green crosshairs centre screen. And finally, as we've already mentioned, the autothrust is active, as its depiction is coloured white. Were this to be displayed blue, the autothrust would be simply armed and awaiting a command to actually do something. So in summary, this depiction of the PFD shows the aircraft on glide slope, on localizer, descending at 700 feet per minute through 1,520 feet or 460 metres at an indicated airspeed of 140 knots. As the instruction to stop descent was received, Captain Gregorian used the available automation to command a vertical speed of 0. The aircraft continued to track inbound on the localizer, but importantly was no longer descending on the glide slope. Hence, maintaining 330 metres, or the equivalent of 1,100 feet, the ideal profile started to slip below the aircraft. the aircraft's pitch attitude increased to 6 degrees in an effort to produce the lift necessary in order to maintain level flight with gear and flap full extended. Autopilot 2 disengaged automatically, since the combination of two autopilots can only work simultaneously during the approach and subsequent go-around procedure. This retirement of the second autopilot and loss of the approach mode was communicated both visually, through a mode change on the FMA, and also a brief oral alert. Had the crew of 967 interpreted the controller's ambiguous instructions as being an order to go around, Airbus procedures are clear and definitive in the required crew response, as this extract from the A320 FCOM, or Flight Crew Operations Manual, shows. The pilot flying is instructed to advance the thrust levers to toga. This means pushing the thrust levers as far forward as possible to ensure the maximum thrust available, while simultaneously rotating the aircraft to the go-around attitude of 15 degrees and announcing go-around, so that from a crew coordination point of view, everyone is on the same page as to what is happening. Thereafter follows some configuration issues where the flaps and gears are retracted on schedule. Such is the procedure with the autopilot disengaged. If on the other hand the autopilot is engaged, provided the flap lever is in any other position than 0, once the thrust levers are placed in the toga detent, the autopilot itself will automatically pitch the aircraft up to the desired go-around attitude. Following this initial change in flight path, the subsequent procedures specific for the approach onto runway 06 at Sochi state that the aircraft must make an early right-hand turn onto the reciprocal heading of 240 degrees in order to avoid the terrain ahead. Likewise, in the interest of terrain avoidance, the turn is to be conducted at a maximum speed of 200 knots and a minimum bank angle of 20 degrees, in order that the radius of turn be kept as tight as possible. Finally, the aircraft is to acquire and maintain an altitude of 600 metres, or 2,000 feet. But as I mentioned earlier, Captain Gregorian did not interpret the controller's intervention as an instruction to go around. So, rather than follow Airbus guidelines, he began to manoeuvre the aircraft in quite a literal reaction to the commands given. At the very same time as the aircraft was levelled using the autopilot, the flight data recorder recorded a momentary pilot input on the rudder pedals, resulting in their slight movement in the direction of the intended turn. Two things of note here. Firstly, the rudder pedals, particularly with the autopilot engaged, require a minimum force equivalent to about 10 kilograms of pressure in order to move them from the neutral position, which is not an insignificant amount of effort. Secondly, Airbus training is to specifically avoid manual rudder inputs, except in case of crosswind landings or operation under circumstances of asymmetric power. 4 seconds after the aircraft was levelled, Captain Gregorian began to manoeuvre it exactly as the controller had instructed. A right-hand turn was commenced onto a heading of 170 with a roll angle of 25 degrees, while still maintaining an altitude of 340 metres, the equivalent of about 1,100 feet. It's important to note that Airbus does not recommend manoeuvring the aircraft in such a configuration, gear down, flap full, while attempting to maintain level flight. At the same time, the FCU target altitude was inadvertently reset from 2,000 feet, or 600 metres, to 3,200 feet, the equivalent of 980 metres, and an open climb was engaged. The crew were no doubt unaware at the time, but the degree to which the altitude target was reset will prove significant. Where the previous open descent mode facilitated descent by reducing power to idle and controlling the descent speed by way of pitch inputs from the elevator, in open climb, the auto thrust will advance engine thrust to the maximum climb power limit and subsequently again control the desired climb speed with pitch inputs through the elevator, although the exact sequence of events is actually governed by the target altitude set by the crew for final acquisition. For altitude changes of less than 1,200 feet, as open climb mode engages, the autopilot will pitch for a target climb value of 1,000 feet per minute and adjust engine power accordingly in order to maintain the desired climb speed. This despite the fact that the FMA would have the observer believe that full climb thrust was being used, which isn't actually the case. The logic is sound really. For a modest change in altitude of 1,000 feet, let's not be overreactive. However, if the target altitude is in excess of 1200 feet from the aircraft's current altitude, as was the case with 967 through the inadvertent selection of 3200 feet, once open climb is engaged, autopilot logic will first and foremost command a pitch-up moment in an effort to acquire a target vertical speed in the climb of 8,000 feet per minute. A significant difference in design logic, resulting in a far more abrupt entry than would have been observed in the first example. Engine power is increased through the autothrust in order to support this pitch change, and as the engine power increases above 95% of the maximum climb limit, autopilot logic will be amended in order that the pitch will be used to maintain the desired climb speed as the engine thrust settles at and maintains 100% of the available climb thrust. Furthermore, if the open climb mode is engaged within 30 seconds of the aircraft levelling off, as was the case with 967, the autopilot is authorised to use vertical acceleration up to a maximum of 1.3 g, whereas the usual logic will only allow for half this value. The combination of all these factors conspired against the crew of 967. Over the next 16 seconds, the aircraft started to climb rapidly with a vertical acceleration of 1.3 g, resulting in a climb rate of just under 2,500 feet per minute. With such an abrupt manoeuvre, the angle of attack likewise increased to just under 11 degrees. This combination of rapid pitch change combined with the significant resultant drag from the current configuration caused the speed to reduce to 129 knots, 8 knots below the target speed for the approach. The downward trend arrow seen on the PFD would have been similar to what the crew would have experienced, as the lower tip of the arrow gives a visual prediction of where the current deceleration rate will take the aircraft over the next 10 seconds. At 22:12 and 04 seconds, the oral low energy warning was triggered.
Speed, speed, speed.
The A320 FCOM describes this warning as an indication that the aircraft's energy is decreasing to the limit below which engine thrust must be increased in order to regain a positive flight path angle. In response, Captain Gregorian did exactly that, and manually advanced the thrust levers from their current position in the climb detent, which will only allow for a maximum of climb thrust, to the toga position, which ensures the total and absolute maximum thrust available on the engines. As well as this obvious increase in engine power, simultaneously a number of other sublogics kick in. The automated pitch mode reverts to SRS, or specific reference speed, a tighter version of the previous speed pitch control laws, and the roll mode defaults to go around track. Here the aircraft has been designed to maintain the track across the ground at the instant the thrust levers were placed into the toga detent. As 967's turn continues to the right, this desired go-around track has been left behind, and thus the autopilot and the roll bar of the flight director commands a hard turn to the left in order to reacquire. Furthermore, once the thrust levers are placed into the toga detent, the autothrust, by design, reverts to the armed mode. It will only become active again once the pilot makes a conscious effort to retard them back into the climb detent. Where they are now, engine output is at a maximum, and has no other function which would require the usage of an autothrust. One can only imagine how the pace of events and multiple mode changes occurring over such a short time frame has completely overwhelmed Captain Gregorian. Indeed, in the absence of any monitoring calls from his first officer, one can assume him to be equally disorientated by the developing situation. What only seconds earlier was an attempt to simply turn and climb has rapidly turned into a dangerously depleted energy state, the correction of which has caused the direction of the turn to be reversed. 2 seconds later, obviously concerned and confused with the automation's behaviour, Captain Gregorian disengaged the autopilot and decided to try and manually recover the situation. Post-accident simulator reproductions showed perfect convergence with those of Armavia Flight 967. In effect, during the manoeuvre, the autopilot functioned exactly as it had been designed to. Furthermore, these simulations provided detailed technical analysis of how the flight might have progressed under different circumstances. What investigators learned was that had the published Airbus procedures been followed, immediate application of toga power and rotation to 15 degrees, the aircraft's speed would never have dropped below the initial target approach speed of 137 knots, and consequently the low energy warning would never have been triggered. Even if these actions had have been completed by the pilot in the absence of an autopilot, the procedure would still have been completed safely without any undue stress on the crew. Also, although the Airbus procedure calls for reconfiguration of the flap and gear on schedule, the simulator reconstructions proved that once the correct pitch and power values were adopted, even the failure to reconfigure the aircraft would not have impacted on the safe execution of the procedure. Finally, it transpired that continuation with their improvised procedure would not have proven critical to the safety of the flight had the autopilot have been left engaged. Yes, a reduction in speed was experienced during each simulation of just such a scenario, usually the magnitude of 10 to 12 knots. Yes, the low energy warning was consistently triggered, but importantly, the aircraft consistently recovered once the automation was left engaged. But again, these simulations relate to what might have been. What has been established as fact is that Captain Gregorian did intentionally disengage the autopilot during this dynamic, disorientating and confusing phase of flight. In analysing the final 56 seconds of Flight 967, it should be noted that the crew were most probably in a state of significant psycho-emotional stress, caused by a number of contributing factors, not least of which being the unstable weather conditions at destination during the whole of the flight, which created an anxiety amongst the crew as to whether or not they would even land at Sochi. Also, when issued, the instruction to stop descent was a non-standard verbal communication from the controller, and most probably took them by surprise. Indeed, as a foreign carrier, it is plausible that such intervention would not have been anticipated at all. Go-arounds by their very nature are infrequently actioned by pilots on the line, to such an extent that throughout the course of a career, the average pilot may only perform such a manoeuvre for real perhaps half a dozen times. The time of day at 2 AM local was certainly not conducive to optimum cognitive reasoning or action, and most probably would have impacted negatively on their performance, and without question, the perception that the aircraft's automated systems were somehow conspiring to work against their actions and intentions. From this point on, the change in intonation between the two crew members further adds to the belief that the collective stress levels are quickly on the rise. Shortly after autopilot disengagement, Captain Gregorian made a forward input on the side stick of approximately 9.5 degrees, about 60% of its full available movement in that axis. This caused the pitch attitude to reduce to 4 degrees, with a corresponding reduction in angle of attack to about 2.5 degrees, and a pronounced reduction in the aircraft's rate of climb. Simultaneously, a roll input was made to the right, presumably in an effort to continue the right-hand turn per the controller's instruction, and counteract the autopilot's previous tendency to roll left back to the track which was being made good when the thrust levers were placed into the toga detent. Again, a momentary manual rudder input in the direction of the turn was recorded, which in all likelihood was stress-induced and not a conscious, deliberate act. Over a 5-second period, the target altitude, which had been inadvertently set to 3,200 feet at the initiation of the manoeuvre, was now reduced to the correct setting for the procedure of 2,000 feet, or the equivalent of 600 metres. This action was accompanied by intense crew discussions, indicating that the crew were actually aware of the correct target altitude for acquisition, but with the autopilot now disengaged, achieving this target would have to be completed manually by the crew. In the context of illusion and disorientation, the change in the target altitude from 3,200 feet to 2,000 feet resulted in the flight director pitch bar reducing the magnitude of its pitch up command. To the crew, the pitch bar or horizontal bar on the flight director would have appeared to lower on the screen. This relative movement may have provided the crew with the false illusion that the aircraft had abruptly pitched up, a tendency which Captain Gregorian had experienced with commencement of the manoeuvre and was conscious to eliminate. At 22:12 and 24 seconds, during this period when the target altitude was being reset, the thrust levers were moved from the toga to flex and then climb detent. This had the effect of activating once again the auto thrust, and reduce the engine power output from toga to maximum climb thrust. It was suggested that the thrust lever movement was coincidental with the aircraft reaching the thrust reduction and acceleration altitude of 1,500 feet above the ground. Under normal circumstances, this would signify that the initial takeoff or go-around procedure had been completed, and the aircraft was now moving by design into the next phase of acceleration and retraction of the flaps on schedule. In providing guidance to complete this task, the flight director would provide a command to reduce pitch somewhat and allow the fixed power setting of climb thrust accelerate the aircraft to a safe speed where retraction of the flaps would be possible. As a result, from the diagram it can be seen that the target speed has now increased to 203 knots, the minimum speed at which the aircraft at this weight should be flown with the flaps retracted. As the crew have not yet attempted to reconfigure the flaps, the black and red bar which has appeared on the speed scale depicts the maximum speed at which the aircraft should be flown in the current configuration. This speed is referred to as VFE, so the lower end of the black and red bar, shown here, displays VFE for flap full. At 22:12 and 28 seconds, the controller instructed the crew to contact radar. Armavia 967 contact radar 119.7, to which the crew simply responded 967 roger. At about the same time, the captain again made a forward pitch input on a side stick, followed by a right roll input. These resulted in the pitch attitude reducing to 1.4 degrees with a corresponding increase in roll to 30 degrees right hand bank, followed 4 seconds later by a second forward input on the side stick. The reason why Captain Gregorian would handle the aircraft in such a manner, specifically the frequent nose-down inputs on the side stick, could never be explained with complete certainty. However, the subsequent report did attempt to propose some explanation. There would be a strong subsequent suggestion that Captain Gregorian was subjected to the influence of stomatographic illusion. Somatographic and somatogyral illusions are the two most common forms of vestibular or false sensation illusions which can be encountered when no clear horizon is present and flying is wholly or partially attempted by external visual reference. The vestibular organs are part of the human body's mechanism for achieving postural stability. Changes in linear, vertical or angular acceleration which occur as a result of the flight control inputs are detected by the vestibular system and may give rise to either or both of these illusions. These illusions may be triggered, for example, on foot of an imperceptible slow change in motion, typical of a roll rate of less than 2 degrees per second. Alternatively, following a sustained acceleration of 10 to 15 seconds in any one direction, it may be falsely perceived that the acceleration is actually stopped, or indeed where sensory stimulation from the angular motion of the head and the aircraft occurs simultaneously in two different planes. A good example of this would be the interruption of the pilot's forward gaze to look upwards at an overhead panel while the aircraft was also in angular motion. Both somatographic and somatogyral illusions are most likely to occur in conditions of marginal external visual reference, or in visual dark night conditions with no perceptible horizon. Whilst there are many situations in which these illusions can occur, one of the most likely and certainly the most dangerous is with the positive changes in acceleration which accompany the initiation of a go-round or the transition to initial climb after takeoff. In both cases, the consequences can rapidly lead to controlled flight into terrain, where the condition is not recognised, or alternatively, in-flight loss of control, where the condition is recognised but the complexities of the recovery are subsequently mishandled. Flap and gear retraction, with changes in thrust while attempting to achieve a specific climb path, involve considerable changes in acceleration which in themselves are conducive to stomographic illusionary effects. As the inputs to establish sustained climb take effect, a perception of excessive pitch up may occur. This can lead to the fear that the critical angle of attack is being approached. The instinctive and often subconscious response is to push the nose down in the belief that a return to a more normal angle of attack is being achieved. If the aircraft is bank, intentionally or otherwise at the time, the perception of angular acceleration may be underestimated because of stomatogyral illusion, leading to the instinctive tendency to increase the angle of bank. Sometimes the strength of these illusions may be so intense that even a conscious cross-reference with the flight instruments, which would act to validate the presence of an illusion, may not be convincing enough for the affected pilot to take corrective action. That said, however, in a multi-crew aircraft, it's extremely uncommon for both crew members to be simultaneously affected. Hence, effective monitoring becomes essential if the risk of an unintentional excursion is to be avoided. With 967, what was compelling evidence of illusionary influence was the recorded fact that the frequency and magnitude of nose-down inputs increased as the aircraft paralleled the shoreline in its continued turn to the south. Up until this time, the broken cloud cover ahead of the aircraft would have facilitated an intermittent view of the coastal lights. This visual confirmation of the pilot's attitude in relation to the real world outside would have been sufficient to overpower any potential illusionary effect. However, as the turn to the south continued, this safeguard would have been compromised, and the subsequent potential for exposure to such effects greatly increased. 10 seconds later, at 22:12 and 34 seconds, further nose-down inputs were recorded. Another suggested reason for these counterintuitive pitch inputs could rest in what Captain Gregorian was observing on the PFD. For a period of time now, engine power output has been either at toga or at the slightly reduced value of climb power. The combination has resulted in a rapid longitudinal acceleration. Indeed, hypothetically, this is the root cause of the illusionary effects the captain is potentially experiencing. Under such circumstances, it takes only seconds for the aircraft to approach the flap limiting speed of VFE. The investigation team deemed it quite likely that subconsciously the captain had pushed the nose down in an effort to escape the fast approaching limitation, whereas in effect the action would have had the complete opposite effect and would only have added to compound the situation. A parallel was drawn to the aircraft's TCAS, or built-in collision avoidance system. Once this system has been triggered and a potential collision threat exists, the pilot is required to maneuver the aircraft with appropriate pitch inputs away from the conflicting rate of descent or rate of climb, as shown in the vertical speed indicator in red. In other words, to avoid the identified threat of collision, stay away from the rates of climb or descent, which would place you in the red zones. Could this fundamental survival instinct have subconsciously influenced Captain Gregorian's actions? Well, interestingly enough, and in support of this theory, every time the indicated airspeed approached the flap limitation speed, the flight data recorder did record a forward input on the side stick. At 22:12 and 36 seconds, the crew's last communication with the ground was recorded. Sochi, Armavia 967. The first officer's call was incomplete as the captain interrupted, instructing him to retract the flaps as the indicated airspeed reached VFE for the current configuration of flap full, triggering the overspeed warning. Improvising a fix to the unusual situation they found themselves in, the first officer retracted the flaps from full to configuration 2. This reset the VFE indication on the PFD from 177 knots to the new value for flap 2 at 200 knots. However, with the engine power still set at climb, the acceleration continued and almost instantaneously VFE for flap 2 was reached, again triggering the overspeed warning. Hastily, the flaps were again retracted to configuration 1 as the overspeed warning triggers again. The situation has now fast become uncontrolled, and the crew's actions are being completely reactive to unfolding events. With selection of flap 1, VFE was again reset to 215 knots. This configuration actually provides 18 degrees of leading edge slats and 10 degrees of trailing edge flaps. As the trailing edge is more susceptible to aerodynamic loading as the speed approaches VFE, 5 knots shy of this limitation, the flaps will automatically retract to 0, with VFE being reset to 230 knots for the leading edge alone. The flight data recorder again recorded a further nose down and right roll input on the side stick. Pitch reduced, and airspeed along with rate of descent increased as a result. Furthermore, additional rudder inputs in the direction of the turn were also recorded, which would have acted to tighten the turn and aggravate the already alarming rate of descent still further. At 22:12 and 47 seconds, 15 seconds before impact, the ground proximity warning system sounded, and at the same time the first officer's call out of level off was recorded. Altitude had now reduced to just over 1,300 feet, or 400 meters. Indicated airspeed had increased to 211 knots. Pitch angle had decreased to 12 degrees nose down, and a roll angle had developed to 39 degrees right bank, with the descent rate increasing to 4,400 feet per minute. At this moment, the first officer intervened and moved his side stick to the full left stop position to counter the increasing right bank, while the captain continued to make control inputs to increase the right bank still further. With regard to Airbus fly-by-wire philosophy, this dual input situation is prohibited, where both pilots make simultaneous inputs on their side sticks respectively. The two inputs are mathematically summed, with the result being less than either pilot had intended. Flight data recorder data would reveal that the first officer attempted to counter bank only. However, while moving the side stick sideways to the left stop position, he had made unintentional forward control inputs on it as well, an inadvertent parasitic consequence of his attempt to reduce the aircraft's bank angle. While intervening, the first officer had not pressed the takeover push button, which would have nullified any simultaneous input from the captain's side stick. Thus, as previously mentioned, both pilots' control inputs were added and averaged. Normally, such a situation would have triggered a dual input synthetic voice alert. However, with the enhanced ground proximity warning system already enunciated at the time, it took priority and the dual input alert was suppressed. Neither was aware that the other was acting in a way to maneuver the aircraft. At this most critical of junctures, when it was needed most, the actions of the two pilots was not coordinated. The captain twice moved the side stick halfway backwards, possibly reacting to the enhanced ground proximity warning system, but at the same time the co-pilot was inadvertently making nose-down inputs, which might have led the captain to believe that the aircraft response to the control inputs in the pitch channel was not adequate. By 22:12 and 49 seconds, the vertical speed had become 5,000 feet per minute. As the speed rapidly approached VFE for flap 1, the autothrust was triggered into a mode reversion. Sensing that a significant overspeed of the leading edge was inevitable, it would finally switch to speed mode in an effort to limit the actual indicated airspeed at a value equivalent to the VFE figure. However, while the aircraft was making a last-ditch effort to structurally protect itself, at 22:12:51, 3 seconds later, the captain abruptly moved the thrust levers to the idle position and then back to the climb detent. This resulted in disengagement of the autothrust and the cancellation of this protective reversion. The descent rate had now reached 6,000 feet per minute, and altitude had decreased to 933 feet, or just 284 meters. At 22:13:01, the FDR recorded retraction of the high-lift leading-edge devices to the fully retracted position. The combined control actions of the captain and FO had resulted in a decrease of the roll angle to almost wings level, a modest reduction in pitch angle to 7 degrees nose down, and a slightly shallow descent rate of about 4,500 feet per minute, with surprisingly persistent right rudder inputs throughout. With the aircraft now out of control and the ground proximity warning system screaming out for the crew to take corrective action, Armavia 967 was fast running out of time. In order to recover from such a situation, Airbus procedures are clear and lacking in any ambiguity. The pilot must apply maximum power available while simultaneously rotating the aircraft nose up by means of immediate and full aft deflection of the side stick. Any angle of bank should be eliminated and the lift vector reorientated into the vertical in order to obtain the maximum lift possible from the wing.
Terrain, pull up, pull up.
At 22:13:02, 1 hour, 25 minutes and 52 seconds after departure from Yerevan, and a mere 74 seconds after the discontinuation of the approach, both the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorders ceased recording within 400 milliseconds of each other, as electrical power was lost to both. Despite the actions undertaken by both pilots at the last seconds of the flight to deflect the elevator to the nose-up position, the combined actions were ineffective in saving the aircraft, and 967 impacted the water at an indicated airspeed of 285 knots or 528 kilometers per hour, a vertical speed of 4,400 feet per minute, with a pitch attitude of 5 degrees nose down and a roll angle of 10 degrees to the right. The force of the impact was unsurvivable, resulting in the loss of all 113 lives on board. The airplane wreckage sank to a depth of about 500 metres. Only a small portion of the wreckage, less than 5%, was found and recovered from the water's surface. Looking from behind at the nose dome, it was noticeable that almost a half of it was missing, approximately a section between the 4 and 10 o'clock positions. The type of damage made it possible to conclude that the airplane did not hit the water nose first. The lower part of both the left and the right main landing gear structures were found, largely intact. The main landing gear tyres were intact and inflated. Based on the damage, it was concluded that at the moment of impact the landing gear was in the extended position. Although not completely intact, a large portion of the vertical fin, along with a fragment of the rear left fuselage, survived. There were no corrosion traces on the primary structural elements and on the rupture faces themselves, with the manufacturer's anti-corrosion coating still present. Although the upper fin was ruptured and the lower part of the rudder was severely damaged, it nonetheless moved easily. The surface of the left elevator was almost completely reconstructed from the recovered fragments. A fragment of the right elevator of about 1 metre in length also survived. The identified interior fragments of the passenger cabin had been laid out in order to inspect for any evidence or trace of fire, of which there was none. An inspection of the recovered life jackets was conducted in order to ascertain whether or not they had been used before the impact with the water. Some of the jackets were found still packed, others without packaging but not inflated. Thus it was concluded that they were not used. Apart from these major fragments, investigators found some fragments of the lower side parts of the engine fan cowls, and both engine and APU fire extinguishers. These were discharged as their safety valves and check valves on the filling connectors had been torn off by the impact. None of the fragments bore any traces of fire. On the surviving partition that had been installed next to the left forward passenger door, the forward attendance panel used for control of the internal lighting equipment and the loudspeaker in the cabin remained. In addition to physical debris, rescuers recovered 52 bodies and numerous human body fragments from the water surface. Armavia 967, like all other aircraft accidents, was a collection of failed parts. The weather, air traffic control, the crew, and the interrelationship between man and machine. From the time they were established in the centre line while descending and cleared to land, both pilots shared a common plan. They were sure they were going to land, and this no doubt alleviated some of the evident psycho-emotional strain which had been observed beforehand. The configuration of the aircraft and pre-landing actions were coordinated, and the crew appeared to operate as a cohesive team. The controller's sudden and unexpected order to stop the descent surprised them both, and acted in a way to undo any cohesiveness which may have been present. From that moment on, verbal comments were made almost exclusively by the first officer, as the captain's focus became so constricted as to render him no longer a functional member of the crew. His communication effectively ceased, as he failed to announce his intentions following the discontinued approach, and began to act unilaterally. Alarms and warnings were reacted to in an impulsive manner, without any thought for effective and appropriate crew task sharing. As the scenario quickly developed, neither of the pilots had any real overall vision of the situation or any anticipatory capacities. This lack of adherence to SOPs and lack of teamwork contributed to the pilots losing situational awareness, most likely as a result of illusionary influences, and made it impossible for them to regain control of the aircraft. Experience in aviation has clearly shown how important call-outs are to ensure that both crew members are fully in the information loop regarding the various autoflight system modes, and more importantly the ultimate trajectory the flight is taking. To this end, the tasks at hand overwhelmed the crew of Flight 967, for which they paid the ultimate price.